Hi, I'm Colin Morgan, executive producer of Built to Sell Radio. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, you're going to absolutely love our new newsletter, Built to Sell News. We share actionable tips and insights to help you get inside the mind of an acquirer and punch above your weight when it comes time to exit. To subscribe, simply head over to builttosell.com/subscribe to sign up for free today.
Kaelon Egan, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Yeah, well, thanks, John. Appreciate you having me. It's been an experience getting here, given what we dealt with last time.
Tell me about AccelaSchool. What did you guys do?
So AccelaSchool was really I think it was the result of working in the public sector in education for 10 years, which is what I did. I had actually kind of an interesting story. Straight out of high school, I did some post-secondary education, but I was kind of doing night classes while working full-time for the school district that I graduated from. And I ended up moving full-time into an IT position at that school district. And over that 10-year period that I held various roles, because of course my attention can't be to one thing for too long, I held various roles there. And in those positions, I had kind of developed an idea around where I think the data collection process was moving in K-12 education. So I ended up creating a product. It was called eCollect Forms. And actually, it was originally called Form Builder. But it was basically kind of a digitization of the enrollment process that school districts deal with now, which is very paper intensive, or at least has been over time, pretty paper intensive. Back then, it was kind of a segment of the education, K-12 public education market. Private education, private institutions kind of have a similar process. But I created that product and ended up forming the business to specifically to provide the kind of experience and data collection that I didn't really see. So, and I use the word target because I needed to specifically target school districts where I thought maybe they would be most benefited by that kind of tool. But
so these are these forms, like when my kid goes on a field trip,
yes,
I have to fill out a form, and now it's all electronic. It used to be paper and sign, but now it's electronic. Is that the kind of stuff?
Yep, exactly. And there's segments in K-12 schools. If you've got kids, if your listeners have kids, they'll probably know that, teachers are sending paper forms home. Sometimes it's in the backpack of the students and they can get lost. And then there's privacy concerns with the enrollment process, getting into school being very paper intensive and having to kind of transfer these pieces of paper around. Now, today, it's a little bit more modernized, especially post-COVID, which my acquisition was actually just prior to the pandemic. But post-pandemic, most schools, I would say, have kind of moved much further into digitizing any of these very paper-intensive processes like enrollment, but it wasn't the case back then.
How did you sell this product? Because, the thing I kind of am allergic to is sort of selling to bureaucracy. I can't imagine a worse job than to try to sell to a school district, because there's so many competing motivations. There's so many stakeholders, and the bureaucracy would just drive me nuts. Am I what was that like?
You're not unique. I think actually, if any of your listeners are looking to go into the K-12 space, that's the biggest challenge. That's always what I get. If any startup founders are talking to me about navigating that space, it's always, how do you navigate the sales cycle? Because it is very lengthy and bureaucratic. There's a lot of processes that the decision makers really have to go through to get a purchase made. I think it's part of the reason why sometimes we see schools as being a little bit more antiquated and not maybe a little bit more resistant to change, is because there are a lot of things that they have to do to move forward on initiatives, let alone communicating those changes to the various stakeholders that exist in school districts. We're talking parents, counselors, principals, and everything in between, teachers. So I would say that the benefit that I had is I understood it. I spoke that language. I also
worked in it for 10 years.
Because I worked in it for 10 years. Exactly. So when you can relate to a problem, then you can speak to it very eloquently. So not only was I a parent experiencing some of those things, but I worked in a school district where I saw it across every single department. So when you have that kind of benefit, you can speak to every area of the sales cycle and potentially the benefit to each of those areas.
And
so
Dylan, how did you transfer that expertise that you had into the brains of the people you hired to do the selling on your behalf?
That's a really good question. I think so. For the most part, I don't think to be very candid, the size of my company at acquisition time, we were just kind of about to be hitting that next phase, which certainly.
How many employees were you at the time?
We were 15 employees when we were acquired.
So you were still doing most of the selling yourself.
I was still, exactly. That was my answer. I was still doing most of the selling myself. So it wasn't that I was building the relationships, which is really what I needed. By the way, I'd give that advice to your listeners. A smaller company, you're not going to get out of it as a founder. I was in everything. I knew everything at every layer of the company and every area of the business. I knew what was going on, and I was likely participating in some way. Now, not in every detail, because if I am, then I'm just slowing things down. But the selling process in particular, I would help our sellers navigate once it got to decision makers or buyers, because we used a little bit of a different approach. We used a much more organic bottoms up approach than a top down approach. So when you're selling to school districts, or at least, and I think selling to anybody, I mean, I think you try to get the people who are actually experiencing the pain to understand what that solution could do for them. And if you can do that effectively, then they're going to sell it up. And then when you get to those decision makers, then it's about having conversations about ROI and what kind of return you should expect and what you should look for and how to roll it out. And rolling out software, obviously in the K-12 space can be challenging. But those are the things that we would, and then maybe we're negotiating on price. But prior to that, we've already worked to build the relationship with the people using or experiencing the pain. We've built that relationship already. We've built their trust. We've worked with them directly, and any salesperson can do that generally. And then it's just about covering the gap in product knowledge too, because at the startup stage, your listeners, I'm sure, know, you're not going to necessarily define, okay, you're going to have a sales operations specialist, and then you're going to have an SDR, and then you're going to have an account manager, and then you're going to have a solution engineer. You're not going to get that. You're going to get one account exec that has to do basically all of those things if you're lucky. And
or
so,
you get a founder doing it all.
Correct.
So how did you finance this business? Did you just bootstrap it? Or did you get some?
I bootstrapped. Yeah, I bootstrapped it. So I would say from like an investment perspective, I was very green when it came to that. I generally grew the business. Obviously, we brought on staff, some strategic hires, grew intentionally in some ways, but it was very organic, very guerrilla, trying to go to as many areas as we could to get the word out. And by doing that and just kind of hustling as much as possible, I was able to always run profitably. And so I didn't need investment. So when I looked at investment opportunities, I didn't necessarily need to rely on those to continue to grow the business. Now, I will say, I wouldn't say I regret some of those decisions, but I do think it's important for founders to build a network of professionals that they trust. I did have like a bit of an advisory board. Those advisory board members, for the most part, were not super familiar with the space. It is somewhat of a unique space, education in particular. But I would advise that if it's possible to build kind of a board related, investor related, then great, because you know what, they're going to give you generally good advice because they want to see the same returns that you might. And I didn't have as much of that, and that's something that I think it brought challenges to the growth of the business overall, just because it was kind of me navigating it somewhat organically and bootstrapping it. That's one of the things I probably would do differently.
What triggered you to want to sell it? 15 employees, you're still relatively early in your life cycle.
Yeah.
Was there some straw that broke the camel's back or some sort of triggering event?
To some extent, probably my attention, maybe, it's interesting to say that, but the reality is I think I was at a point, I was in my late 20s when I started the company. It's like late 20s when I started originally, early 30s, getting up on mid 30s when I sold the company. And the reality is I think I don't know if I felt like I could scale it in the way that I thought it needed to be. And that's kind of what triggered some of the conversations to start. And PowerSchool was kind of the natural suitor for me. The company was very geared toward PowerSchool customers, and my AccelaSchool is really considered a tuck-in acquisition for PowerSchool. It's one of those kind of complementary acquisitions that, generally barely gets mentioned because it rolls up to a much larger platform, a much larger initiative within the company. And like I said, I think it was just kind of getting to a position where I felt that scaling it would be maybe beyond what I felt I could do reasonably. And as the kind of partnership conversations started to progress, then it kind of naturally became more around economics and what PowerSchool could offer from a scalability perspective that drew me in that direction.
I just did a kind of catch-up interview with a guy named James Ashford, who sold his company. It was a software for accounting firms, and he sold it to Sage, the big UK-based software provider. But when he started the company, he created a logo that he put up in his office, and it was his company name, Go Proposal, and then underneath he put a Sage company or an Intuit company or a Zero company as a sort of reminder to what his goal was, right?
Yeah.
Was to get Sage or Intuit or Zero to buy it. Were you thinking the same way about PowerSchool? I mean,
yes.
at what point did you know, okay, this is who I'm going to sell this thing to?
Probably when I built it. No, just kidding.
No, that's an okay answer.
I mean, it legitimately was when I built the company. The concept was always there that I had some specific directions I could take the company. In one direction, I could really focus my efforts on, I use the word targeting very loosely here, but kind of targeting a specific segment of the market where I felt it could benefit a single suitor very naturally, like a PowerSchool. So your listeners thinking about the same thing. If you've got a potential suitor, you're always going to be making a decision. Do you want to target that segment and be very attractive to that suitor? Or do you want to go more of a generic direction and be attractive to multiple suitors, but obviously not being super beneficial to any one of them? There's pros and cons in either direction.
Let's get practical for folks, because what you're describing, I would characterize kind of like building a Lego system. Like you were really building this company so that PowerSchool would find it irresistible. Can you give our listeners an example of a decision that you made during the growth of your business to make it fit better with PowerSchool? Like what kind of decisions specifically did you take to make it irresistible for PowerSchool?
Well, one was integrating directly with it and building the functionality of the product to complement that, the platform that, PowerSchool really, and PowerSchool users, I think, needed that additional support. So we were really targeting that product specifically, that platform, that ecosystem. And I'll say even more specifically, it was when I needed to make a decision about where I wanted to take the architecture of the product, which back then was called Form Builder. It kind of evolved into eCollect Forms. we could have either continued to invest in the architecture that benefited PowerSchool users, or we could have invested in architecture that would maybe render some functionality less beneficial. It's less integrated, but it's more of a generic platform that anybody could use, right? You don't have to have PowerSchool products. You could use it more generically. That was a very specific intentional decision. I chose to go toward PowerSchool. That decision was probably a defining moment, because going the other way would have potentially lessened our value to PowerSchool and lessened the benefit to our end users. Because remember, school districts were buying our software in large part because of how well integrated it was with the PowerSchool ecosystem. So if I were to go another direction, well, now I may not win as much, and I'm less attractive to PowerSchool from an M&A perspective, but I have more suitor potential, right? I could grow maybe more generically in the market and be integrated with several. So maybe I'm opening up my TAM, but I'm making myself less attractive to this potential suitor. So I intentionally made that decision to go toward PowerSchool.
And at the same time, I guess it also begs the question, did PowerSchool ever threaten to build what you had created themselves? If you were just sort of this kind of nice, natural tuck-in and they can pick you up for a song, then sure. But if you're going to really drive a hard bargain and you're, perfectly suited for them, they might turn around and say, look, man, you don't have any other options, and we could go build what you've created with your 16 employees in about a weekend.
Yeah.
Did that conversation ever come up, or how did you think about that?
Not only did the conversation come up, but that was probably, and I would think your listeners think the same thing, that is like the foundational fear I had every single night when I went to sleep. The nightmare scenario. What I'll say is that I think this is the ebb and flow of the startup world. That it is, if you have a startup that is smaller, focused, nimble, you're going to have people that can drive functionality and change and a quickness that you likely won't find in larger organizations and larger entities. It's much more difficult for them to operate in that way. So by the time sometimes, now this isn't always the case. I think PowerSchool now does an excellent job of innovation and trying to carve that out. They're doing PowerSchool is doing really great things right now with that innovation. However, it's generally challenging for larger companies to reach that kind of innovation that a startup can. So the intent there is to develop something that just iteratively improves so fast that you get a better product. Now, you haven't scaled yet, so maybe you don't have better support. Maybe you might have cleaner support. You have more direct support, but it's not scaled support. It's not scaled engineering. You don't have full release strategy. Those things are all still very organic, but your product is better. And when that exists, I think it means it makes it much more difficult for anybody to try to copy it. You've got years of experience now in the market of not redefining, but just, and I don't know what the word is, but kind of finessing your product, finding product market fit before anybody else has really been able to do that. And so then it becomes, well, what's easier for a suitor? Is it easier to buy it and just integrate it in, or is it easier to build it? And those are always tough decisions and tough questions, but I think that's kind of the direction that I tried to put the company in, is that if we can compete and operate so fast, then it would be very difficult for a larger company or a larger entity to try to compete. The only competitors that we really had were other companies that were smaller like us trying to do the same thing, but they never had the integration that I had with PowerSchool, which is what I think drove our win rate much higher.
Got it. So let's talk about the actual transaction itself. So you're cruising along, you're kind of positioning yourself for a PowerSchool acquisition. You've been at it for 6 or 7 years. You're feeling like a little bit antsy. Was there did they reach out to you? Did you reach out to them? What actually engaged the conversation?
Yeah. So it was a partnership conversation primarily. So what was driving the conversations, to be quite candid, and I'm sure your listeners can relate, is the sales team. It's like you're a thorn in the side of a sales team because you might be winning against some other options that might exist in the market that the sales team is going to they're gonna not only be speaking to the losses, but they're also going to be speaking the to the potential strategy that could exist in an M&A scenario, or in a partnership scenario. So that's what really drove some of the conversations. Is we think that there's a better together type of scenario, and it starts with a partnership conversation, and then kind of evolves and morphs into an M&A conversation if the timing's right.
At what point did it morph into an M&A conversation? Do you remember the context? I mean, I think our listeners would benefit from understanding, because I think they've all sort of had these sort of loose partnership conversations. But how did you know it was moving from partnership to acquisition? Like, what were the signs?
Yeah, generally I'll say right away. So I think it was pretty clear to me. In a partnership scenario, you are talking about defining the benefit to working together, defining maybe the economics around the relationship, defining how to validate and create success criteria, those types of things. Like, okay, what does this look like and how are we going to measure success? Those are natural partnership conversations. But ours quickly turned into it turned into kind of what opportunities do we have to more directly integrate this into the business, not just in maybe this area of the market and kind of a smaller pilot to test the partnership to kind of see what opportunities exist, but much more broadly. Like the conversation seemed to steer in the direction of kind of immediate offer to the market. And that indicated to me that when I say immediate offer to the market, I mean like every customer could potentially have access to this through, not just a white label position, but, maybe more directly integrated into the business. And I think that's when it started to become clearer to me that there's not really success criteria that we're defining here. This is really turning much more into a commercial transaction. And so I was clear about it. I was much more candid about that. If we want to go in that direction, then we want to be clear about what the next steps are, which by the way, I had no idea what they were.
So did you put that on the table? Did you kind of call the elephant out in the room and say, hey, it looks like we're not really talking about partnership. It looks like you guys want to really explore.
Yeah, I think we both did. I mean, I'm trying to recall some of the specific conversations, but I think we both did. And it was a smaller group setting initially. I mean, it was the SVP of corporate development, who I'm still somewhat close with. Hopefully he likes this once I send it out or once he send it out. But anyway, it was smaller conversations that kind of started to morph into, okay, let's get the product leadership in, let's get engineering leadership to kind of start almost this soft due diligence process, like see what we're dealing with here. And again, those typically don't happen, I think, as much with partnerships. They certainly do, because I know at PowerSchool now, obviously, we want to perform an amount of security auditing and due diligence on our partners, which is really, really important. But it's not always to that kind of deeper level that I was sensing was happening. And so then that larger conversation then morphed back into, okay, let's get much more direct about what the opportunity is.
You were going to bed every night fearing the worst case scenario, which was PowerSchool just to develop something on their own. How did you protect against that possibility as you got further into diligence?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think that probably the best answer that I have is, and it's probably not going to be super great, but it is very hard to protect against that. I think when you get into the deep due diligence that we were in, it's possible that, somebody kind of sees your secret sauce and they say, oh, well, that secret sauce isn't so secret. We can do that. I don't think that tends to occur as much when the conversation starts to collaboratively move to the secret sauce is the founder, or the secret sauce is the product that is very difficult to try to recreate. Like, there's no other secret sauce that exists. There's no magic pill that, PowerSchool could look at to say, hey, we could recreate this. That they could. Anybody could have recreated what we did. But to get to that point, some of these companies, suitors for smaller startups, need to think about the costs incurred getting to that point. And they weigh that with the economics of the deal. And there you are, and that's that. But it could have happened at any point. It could have been like, what, the deal doesn't work. The economics don't make sense. We think we could build this on our own. That's very possible. Always very possible.
I know your time is tight, so let me just kind of get to the chase. What do they offer you for the business, and how were you? What was your reaction to that offer?
I'll say I think that in our initial so I was very, very immature when it came to this, right? And this is probably the big piece of advice that I'd give to your listeners, is make sure that you've got a good advisory group, and that the advice that you're getting is really well-rounded. I think I was very new to it. So I think when I first looked at it, it's kind of like a shock to see it. I mean, it's very interesting seeing the amount that an acquisition typically means, but there's a lot of emotions that come with it. And I think, the reality is it took a while for us to get to a point where I think we're both very comfortable with the economics, but it was not an education back prior to the pandemic it's not like there were massive multiples on EBITDA or revenue or anything like that. I mean, the multiples back then were like 2 to 3x reality.
2 to 3x
revenue.
Okay, got it.
And just very kind of limited. Now, post-pandemic, I think education got a lot more front and center. And now, especially as AI gets introduced into education, there's just so much more opportunity there to really have good fundamental change in education. So it's a little bit different now. But back then, education was like, nobody really wanted to be in that, kind of space where you try to start up a company in education. Can you imagine that, John? You don't have something's wrong if you're trying to start a company in the K-12 education space. It's very challenging to navigate. And so the multiples were not amazing, but again, for somebody who had an interesting high school and post-secondary experience and worked in public education and then started a company not knowing anything about what they were doing, it was such an interesting experience and a great one.
Did you structure the back end like an earnout, or did you get some equity in PowerSchool, or how did they kind of tie you into the business?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if all of the details are public, so I'll be somewhat limited with it, but there was no earnout. I think anytime I see an earnout situation, and I've had a couple of conversations with people about this, it's more of a services business. At least in my experience, it's more of a services business because they need you for something. Really, the only thing that was part of the deal is typically called a holdback, and that is, basically warranties, right? Like the software. This is not vaporware. The software is what you expressed in diligence and what we found. And if there's anything that goes against that, then obviously your buyer has an opportunity to protect itself from that. But it wasn't. It was a very, very simple, kind of cash-free, debt-free deal, and minor stipulations around some of those warranties.
Well, I'm grateful for you spending the time to share it with us. I know your time is precious and you've got to go. If there are folks who wanted to reach out to you, Kaelon, is there a good platform? Are you like a LinkedIn guy or?
LinkedIn. Yeah. I don't, oddly, I don't do a whole lot of social media. So LinkedIn, I rarely post, but I do lurk to see what my network's doing every once in a while. So I think that's a great way to reach out to me. And that's, awesome. I think, how maybe we got connected, which was excellent. I appreciate it, John.
Yeah, no, Kaelon, I appreciate you taking the time to share the story. I appreciate it. And we will put your show notes, your contact information, your LinkedIn profile in the show notes at builttosell.com.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.